If you were to ask Deacon Jim here, would you like a piece of apple pie or a piece of cherry pie? He would respond, yes. Sometimes a question requires a either or answer, a yes and no answer, or a both and answer. And that's what's happening in the way Jesus answers the question that was posed to him. But first, a little bit of background. The Pharisees and the Herodians were truly a diabolical alliance. They were looking for an either-or answer, and what Jesus very cleverly gives them is a both-and answer. It's very clever because the question was, as we hear, designed to trap Jesus. Now, not long before Jesus began his ministry, there was a man named Judas who started an anti-tax revolt. And Judas and all his followers were brutally crucified by the Romans, and their bodies hung on crosses were scattered throughout the area. So the message was very clear. Refuse to pay taxes, and this is what will happen to you. But you also have to remember that the Jews hated paying the tax, because after all, Rome had taken over their land, and then they turned around, and for the honor of stealing their land, they required the Jews to pay a very heavy tax. And the other option, of course, was for Jesus to say, yes, pay the tax. That would have violated the Mosaic law. And for this reason, the coin had the image of Caesar on it. Not only that, but it referred to Caesar as son of the divine Augustus Caesar, therefore making him the emperor, a divinity, a son of God. And on the reverse, the emperor was described as the high priest. And the Mosaic law, as you recall, forbid against graven images and false gods. So the setup here was, depending on how Jesus would answer the question, they would trap him into being either a heretic or a seditionist. In either way, he would lose. So very cleverly, Jesus says, show me the coin. Now the Pharisees, who hated the coin, hated paying the tax, amazingly pulled one out of their pocket. And it revealed their hypocrisy. Jesus had them, he got them right there. And right away, by doing that, Jesus shames them. And it reveals their false premise. And he shows their real intention was based on hatred of him. After all, it was many in the religious leadership that had partnered with the Romans to drive out the Greeks who had taken over their land. And the Herodians had formed an alliance with Herod, and they, in order to have power, wanted to keep it, and so they pleased Herod. So what we're seeing is here, both groups, the Pharisees and the Herodians, have already compromised themselves and their faith and their religion. So Jesus really shows their duplicity and their dishonesty. And he simply answers the question, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God. What Jesus was saying, something every Jew knew, was that everything belongs to God. Sure, we know we come from God, he has created us, and even Caesar in the end has to give to God. And so Jesus lays down an important principle. The state has its autonomy, its legitimate sphere of influence, and it is distinct from the church. And the church does not want to run the government, nor should it, but the church should form consciences and inform of the principles that lead to making a society just. And so the Herodians and the Pharisees were not giving to God. If the coin had the image of Caesar on it, we have the image of the divinity on us, created in the divine likeness. And so they were creating this false dichotomy. Jesus reaffirms the first commandment, I am the Lord, have no false gods before you. If you operate on that principle, then it's not so hard to figure out what to render to Caesar. The psalmist, we often hear things like, we worship God and not the government. And that's a conclusion you can accurately draw from this gospel passage. From this statement of Jesus rendered to God, the Church over the centuries has developed its teaching on what a just and well-ordered society should look like and what civil authorities should do, how they should rule. And Pope John Paul II reminded us in one of his great encyclical letters, Centesimus Annus, that a society that upholds the public recognition of God, the worship of God, the freedom of religion, as well as the dignity of all human life, since we are created in the image and likeness of God, that society will flourish. From this point on, of course, we could make a whole lot of philosophical discussions about the proper role of governments and what it can and cannot demand of its people, but that's for another time. The question here I think we must ask ourselves, are we putting God first? Knowing that we are stamped with the divine image, are we giving to God what belongs to God? Or are we letting other things get in the way? Are we holding anything from God, since really all is His? And so if you were to write a check to God, let's face it, it would have to be a blank check. Look at it this way: what belongs to God is our faith, our trust, our humble service, our surrender, and our fundamental and ultimate allegiance. The Pharisees and the Herodians set a trap for Jesus. He, of course, had the wisdom to see through it. We, however, often get caught in that same trap, and we easily reverse the principles. We give to Caesar what belongs to God, or vice versa. And the best way to avoid the trap is by doing what we are doing right now, worshiping God. And that's always the best assurance for having a well-ordered life. So if you're doing that week in and week out, and I might add trusting God with your money as well, then you will easily figure out what to render to God and what to render to Caesar.